Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to wish you a very happy Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths. And for this week's episode, we're going to go back to 2013 to take a quick look at an album that, I guess, sort of depending on how you look at it, could be considered his solo debut album. It is called The Messenger, by the greatest guitarist of all time, the almighty Johnny Marr. Now, before we get into today's episode, it was brought to my attention a couple times over the past 2 weeks that on my last episode of Morrissey Monday, I may have come across as being a little bit harsh when it came to my review of the newest album by former Morrissey guitarist Boz Borer. Of course, the name of that record is Morrissey Reimagined. So before we get into today's content, I'd like to take a second, if you don't mind, go back, sort of state, reiterate, and clarify the fact that when I reviewed Boz Borer's newest album, Morrissey Reimagined, a review that I stand by, my criticism of the record was meant in no way as a personal attack on Boz Borer. I love Boz Borer. I always have. He is a member of my second favorite band of all time, which is, of course, the classic solo lineup of the Morrissey Band, featuring him, Alan White, Gary Day, and Spencer Coburn. A band that only behind the Smiths is my favorite band of all time. Boz Borer is not only a tremendous musician, but based on all accounts, he is an absolutely outstanding human being. So I just want to make sure it is known that my criticism of the album, Morrissey Reimagined, is in no way meant as a personal dig to Boz Borer. I absolutely love Boz Borer, and I always have. But that being said, Boz Borer isn't totally innocent when it comes to this matter as either. He is using Morrissey's name and likeness to promote what I think is a relatively mediocre project, to continue using Morrissey as somewhat of a meal ticket, despite the fact that their professional relationship is at least currently suspended. So let's not go around and pretend that Boz Borer is perfectly innocent, because at the end of the day, the sad truth is that nobody really cares about Boz Borer's solo material, and at least in my opinion, the Polecats were always sort of a lackluster band. And I'm pretty convinced that Boz Borer doesn't really care what I think at the end of the day. I mean, he is somebody and I am nobody. He is successful and I am a toad, you understand. So I don't really think that he is that concerned about what I think. I also think it's interesting that we live in a society that has become so delicate that it's not enough to get your feelings hurt, but you got to get your feelings hurt for other people. I can't really relate to that. That being said, I still stand by my criticism of the newest Boz Borer album, Morrissey Reimagined. Listening to it over the past week or so hasn't changed my mind much. It is still pretty much a bag of garbage. If you like that album, I mean, God bless you. I have nothing against you personally either, but that record is a tough listen. I've gone back and listened to it a couple times again over the past week, trying to give it more of a chance, because people did say that I was being kind of an ass about it. And it just has absolutely not grown on me. So if you like the album, that's cool. I mean, if you're one of those people who's leaving comments on the various social media platforms of Boz Borer saying that this is an instant classic, man, I simply can't relate to you. I think that you're being dishonest, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with adding a little bit of positivity and politeness in the world. I mentioned that on the video I did when it came to that video. I mean, I am pro-choice. I am militantly pro-choice. I feel as if a woman's right to choose is paramount to our democracy. That being said, I'm not necessarily in favor of people having abortions in public, and this album sort of serves as my reason why. Somebody else mentioned to me in an email this week that Boz Borer has a right to re-record these songs based on the fact that he has songwriting credit on most of this material. And I am not arguing whether or not Boz Borer has the right to re-record this material. I have the right to walk around without a shirt on. That doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. That's all I'm saying. So if you like the album, enjoy it. Go listen to it. I'm not telling you not to enjoy it. It was just something that gave me virtually no pleasure at all. But I just want to make sure it's known that I love you, Bosbor. I know you don't really care what some idiot in Nashville who nobody watches think. But I just want to make sure it's known. I want to put it out there because I did feel as if that episode got a little bit negative, and that is not what this channel is all about. So I love you, Boz. Better luck next time, my friend. Anyway, let's get into today's episode. We're going to be talking about Morrissey, Smith's guitarist, Johnny Marr, the greatest guitarist of all time. And of course, tomorrow night, Johnny Marr is kicking off his U.S. tour with the band James. They are kicking off their tour in Denver tomorrow night. And on next week, actually a week from today, next Monday, I will be out in San Francisco, California, seeing the Johnny Marr and James tour at the Warfield in San Francisco. It is always a great opportunity for me to go back home and put my feet back down in San Francisco, see family, see friends, and have an opportunity especially to go see some music at one of my favorite venues in the city. The Warfield is a very sentimental place as far as I'm concerned. Now, in a perfect world, this show would be at the Fillmore in San Francisco, which is my all-time favorite music venue in the world. But the Warfield is nothing to sneeze at either, and the Warfield to me is a very sentimental venue, at least in my music fandom life, because it is the first place that I ever got a chance to see Morrissey back in 1997 on the Maladjusted tour. But I'm extremely excited to go out and see this tour, see Johnny Marr, see what the set list is like, see how he is sounding. And, of course, he's touring with the band James. That is a band that I have been a big fan of for a long time. This is a band that has a long history with Johnny Marr and the Smiths. And James is a band that I've only had the opportunity to see live once, and it was a long time ago. I mean, this was probably mid to late 1990s. When I saw James, I did see them in, I believe it was San Francisco. It was either San Francisco or San Jose back in sort of the mid to late 1990s, but they were awesome live. I have been sort of purposely, and I always do this when I'm about to see a show that I'm really excited about, I've been sort of avoiding both Johnny Marr and James in terms of the sort of social media, just because I don't really want any, too much of a sneakage into what the set list, especially from, Johnny Marr, what the set list is going to look like. Obviously, the tour hasn't even started yet. It starts tomorrow night in Denver. I cannot wait to go see that show at the Warfield. Another one of my favorite things to do in San Francisco, apart from just being back home in the Bay Area, is getting an opportunity to go check out my holy church, Amoeba Records, on Haight Street in San Francisco. I will probably also be stopping by the Amoeba Records on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley as well, a place that was one of my main haunts back when I lived in the Bay Area back in the up until 2018, really, because that's when my wife and I left the Bay Area the last time. But really, when I lived in the Bay Area from 1996 to 1999, man, I just basically lived on Telegraph Avenue. Anyway, it doesn't really matter about me. Johnny Marr is playing San Francisco next Monday. I will be there. I absolutely cannot wait. Now, Johnny Marr has sort of found himself in the news a fair amount recently, not necessarily based on things that he has done or things that he has said, but based more on the artillery that is being fired at him by his former bandmate, the king of rock and roll, at least as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey. A lot of this started a couple weeks ago after the announcement of the big Oasis reunion that is set for 2025. Morrissey came out not long after the Oasis announcement and made a statement announcing that earlier in 2024, in June of 2024, he and Johnny Marr had both been offered a very lucrative deal to come back and sort of reunite the Smiths and do a big tour, at which point Morrissey himself said that he had agreed to the terms, but it was Johnny Marr who had sort of ended up basically just ignoring the offer. Not necessarily flat out turning it down, but, ignoring the offer. And this past week, Morrissey has also come out and said that he had approved a new Smiths box set, which is going to be called the Smiths Rule OK, apparently. And this was something else that Johnny Marr had either ignored or vetoed outright. And it's funny to think about this. I talked about this on my last episode of Morrissey Monday after the announcement came out that Morrissey had actually accepted the terms to come back together and do sort of a Smiths reunion. Now, I talked about this in the last video. I talk about this every time I talk about the potential of a Smiths reunion, especially post the passing of Smiths bassist Andy Rourke. Without all four of the original members, you just simply can't use that name. Me, as being a diehard, slobbering fanboy, even I won't accept the name The Smiths unless it's Morrissey, Marr, Rourke, and Joyce. I mean, it has to be all four of the original members, or basically you don't get a chance to use the name. But what I was talking about on that last episode was, what would it actually take, and then what would it really look like if this thing came to fruition, if Morrissey and Marr were actually able to set aside all of their differeences and come to the table and actually work out something that would put them on the road together, whether it would be a European tour, an American tour, possibly a world tour. And I've always found it to be a very fun topic of conversation. The Smiths broke up in 1987. I was only 12 years old at the time. This was a band that, despite being my favorite band of all time, is a band that I've never had the opportunity to see live. Now, I've seen Morrissey on several occasions, and it's always great. Never disappointing, but, to have an opportunity to go back and see Morrissey and Marr together is something that, romantically, I think is just a beautiful idea. But I am one of those Smiths fans who has never really pined over this because of this sort of situation between Morrissey and Marr. I mean, you get the sense that these two guys just cannot come together. And if they did, and maybe this is me being cynical, if they did at this point in time, it would be hard not to see it as just being a cash grab. Now, I like to think that both Morrissey and Marr, and Mike Joyce for that matter, have enough integrity that they would never do anything just as a cash grab. So I'm sort of, hoping at least that I'm right in that sense. But if at this point in time, if Morrissey and Marr were to come together, I think that would basically be the only way it could come to happen. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, the Smiths were the greatest band of all time. Now, they may have been relatively short-lived, but this band created magic. I mean, they literally created the greatest music in the history of rock and roll, at least in my opinion. I'm not asking you to agree with me. That just happens to be my opinion. And sometimes I think these things are sort of best left where they are, which is why, although it's fun to talk about a Morrissey-Marr reunion, a Morrissey-Marr and Joyce reunion would be fun. I mean, you could take all of my money. I would be there. As much as I could say that it would be a cash grab and I would sort of be, opposed to it, I can tell you right now, I would be there. I have no integrity. I don't really care. But it would be hard to get past the idea of this just being sort of a cash grab. And it's sort of heartbreaking in a way that these two guys can't at least agree to come together and celebrate the band's legacy. Now, as much as I hate to say this because he is my hero, and I do believe that he's the king of rock and roll, Morrissey is the biggest culprit when it comes to this sort of behavior. I mean, you get the sense that Johnny Marr is just kind of out there trying to live his life, trying to play guitar, trying to make his music, trying to tour, trying to put out records. And Morrissey is the one who can't help himself but stir up all of this drama, which, I mean, I love you, Steve. I do. Trust me. I love you. You're my hero of all time. But come on, man. You're 65 years old and you are still creating all of this drama that is virtually unnecessary. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. I was somebody in my younger years that could stir up some drama. I could create a dust cloud, no problem. But at a certain point in my life, I decided that it just was no longer worth it. I mean, Morrissey is 65 years old. I'm 20 years basically behind him, and I made this decision for myself probably 10 years ago that I just did not find the drama to be enjoyable or fun or worth it at the end of the day. And sometimes I wish, as much as I love Morrissey, that he would just grow up a little bit. I mean, Morrissey's sort of turning into that old guy you see walking around the Castro in San Francisco yelling at garbage cans. It reminds the Morrissey-Marr relationship right now. It kind of reminds me of this situation that my wife and I found ourselves in not long after we moved to Nashville. We moved to a neighborhood in Nashville called East Nashville, which is kind of like the cool, I know the word hipster gets overused, but it's sort of like the cool kind of hipster neighborhood in Nashville. And we moved into this house that was not great, but it was a good place to sort of land and get on our feet and kind of get some momentum going. And my wife and I, we are very quiet, kind of unassuming people. As I mentioned before, when I was younger, I could stir up some drama, but those days are behind me. And my wife and I live a very sort of quiet, unassuming life. We don't make a lot of noise. You don't hear a lot of chaos coming from our house. Our house is a very calm place. It is like that by design. And we happened to move in next door to this neighbor who was just chaos. Every single day, it was some other drama that she was stirring up with us for virtually no reason. We were quietly going about our business. Both my wife and I work steady 9-to-5 type jobs. We're not home very often. We aren't out creating a lot of noise and, getting in other people's way. And this lady that we live next to was just psychosis 24/7. And sometimes I get the sense that that is the relationship between Morrissey and Marr. Now, I don't know either of these guys personally, and I love both of them as musicians, but you get the sense that Johnny Marr is a very unassuming, quiet, humble, down-to-earth type of guy who, as I mentioned before, he's just kind of going about his business, right? He plays guitar, he writes these records, he goes out on tour, he does guest spots, he is just an all-around sort of lovely gent. And over here, he has this sort of business partner, if you will, who's just like, just chaos and drama all the time. It has to be sort of exhausting to deal with. Now, I saw a quote, now I don't know if this is actually true or not, but I saw a quote which apparently came from Morrissey after this whole Smiths reunion thing fell apart, where Morrissey supposedly said that he was out there, touring as a national headline act, which is true, and that Johnny Marr was being relegated to opening for a band like James, which is sort of ingenuine in its premise, because the James and Johnny Marr tour is a co-headlining tour. And let's be perfectly honest with you. I mean, Morrissey isn't out there playing Wembley Stadium on his own. Not that I would want that, because I don't want that. But Morrissey is playing venues. He's playing the same size venues that Johnny Marr and James are playing. Yeah, Morrissey is a national headlining act. And yeah, Morrissey is the face of the Smiths. He's definitely had a more successful solo career than Johnny Marr has, but it becomes sort of exhausting, this sort of bickering between these two people whose business that they had together, brought down the shingle almost 40 years ago. It just becomes this thing where it's like, come on, I mean, Morrissey, I love you, dude, I would defend you to the death, but man, this is just getting to the point where it's like, come on, man, you're like 65 years old. Anyway, let's get into this record just a little bit. This is a record that I absolutely love. As I mentioned before, this was a record that sort of, depending on how you look at it, you could sort of see this as being Johnny Marr's solo debut album. Although 10 years before this record came out in 2013, of course, Johnny Marr recorded and released an album with a band called The Healers called Boomslang, an album that is also set to be reissued for a legitimate, authentic, real vinyl release, actually, coming up next week. I'm very excited about this. This is a record, Boomslang, that I actually really like a lot. I did a full episode on Boomslang way back in the archives of Archaic Records, and this is a record that I do like. It isn't necessarily my favorite record of all time. I mentioned this record when I talked about this record when I did the episode on it, that my main grievance with the album Boomslang is that, to me, it sounds a little bit locked in time. I mean, this record came out in 2003, and it sounds very much like 2003. If I had a main sort of gripe with the record, aesthetically at least, in terms of its sound, to me it is too much of kind of an Oasis hand job, which is something that isn't unique in rock and roll, especially the world we're living in right now. This post sort of Oasis reunion news. I mean, we're living in the world of Oasis hand job, which is fine. I'm not the biggest Oasis fan in the world. I don't dislike them, but to me this was a record that I thought paid a little bit too much homage to Oasis and that whole sort of era of Britpop. Now, according to everything that I've read, there was actually supposed to be a second Healers album that was going to come out after Boomslang. It never came to light. I'm not exactly sure what happened to that record. I'm not sure if Johnny Marr just sort of blew up this project, or if he moved on due to some other opportunities that presented themselves, because after the whole Boomslang record came out, not long after this, and this album and its touring cycle, Johnny Marr, of course, famously did his run with Modest Mouse, where he put out 2 records with them in 2007 and 2009, which I thought it was okay. I'm not really the hugest Modest Mouse fan in the world. I'm a casual fan. I think that they're fine. I always found him to be sort of a queer fit for Modest Mouse. I don't think that they sort of complemented each other. I don't think that he was a real compliment to them, and I don't think that they necessarily showcased his guitar playing as well as it could have been. I have the 2 records that Johnny Marr played on just to have them in the archive, and as much as I'm not necessarily the hugest fan of Modest Mouse or those records, really, I mean, I would take them every day over the material that he did with The. Now, The is a band that to me is just a boring, do nothing, say nothing band. I mean, if you are a huge fan of The and you're really passionate about it, which there are those people. I've met people, I know people that are really into The. I don't even get it. I don't even get really even having a negative opinion of The, because that band is snooze-a-palooza son. So I would easily take the Modest Mouse material that Johnny Marr was on over The, even though I felt like Johnny Marr and Modest Mouse didn't necessarily complement each other as entities. At least those records had some personality. I mean, compared to The, those albums are like the height of snugness. In 2009, also, of course, Johnny Marr famously did an album with the band Cribs, which I actually really like. So I think that album is probably better than the records he did with Modest Mouse or The. But this record was released 10 years after the Boomslang album. Johnny Marr came back and decided that it was time for him to pursue his own career. This was a record that, when it was announced, I was very excited about. I mentioned this also when I talked about the Boomslang record in its entirety. This was a record, Boomslang, that, at least here in the United States, now I realize that things were a lot different overseas, especially in the UK, when it comes to some of these artists who kind of like skate past Americans. I'm actually getting ready to do a video coming up this week about an artist that was relatively big over in the UK. In fact, I would make the argument were quite big for a while over in the UK, but a band that slid right past us here in America. So it's not something that never happens. But I remember when the Boomslang album came out, you saw a very tiny amount of publicity and press over it, and it came out, and it just sort of evaporated, which surprised me at the time based on the fact that it is Johnny Marr and of his association with both Morrissey and the Smiths. I thought that this record would do better than it did in the United States. It is a record that I bought pretty much immediately upon its release, and I liked it. I still do. It isn't a record that I necessarily go back and listen to in exceedingly heavy rotation, but I'm extremely excited for the release of this album on vinyl coming out this week. That's something I cannot wait to get my hands on. But this record, The Messenger, was released on February 25th, 2013, so about 10 years after the Boomslang album. And the one thing I'll say about this album compared to Boomslang is there is a real line of demarcation when it comes to the differences between these two albums, which is one reason why I sort of not sure if I consider which one his, solo debut album. I sort of consider Boomslang to be a solo debut album, even though it was played with a band called the Healers. But this one is an album that, to me, there's a real line of demarcation sonically, because to me, this is the album that sort of establishes Johnny Marr's sound as we know it today. I think he, over the course of those 10 years between Boomslang and The Messenger, he sort of developed his own sound. He sort of dropped the Oasis hand jobbery, and I really love the sound that Johnny Marr has sort of created for himself. Obviously, Johnny Marr is, not only is he my favorite guitar player of all time, but I think that he is the greatest guitar player of all time. Sometimes people can sort of snicker at you when you say that, especially people who come from more of a classic rock fan sort of background, people who, worship at the altar of people like Eddie Van Halen and Steve Vai and Yngwie Malmsteen. That's a style of music I've just never had any use for. I find it to be irritating more than anything. I don't think that style of guitar playing ever complements a song. I don't think it has any purpose except for basically just masturbation. I think Johnny Marr's guitar playing on this current string of albums is probably some of the best he's ever done. I mean, you go back and you listen to the Smiths, who are the greatest band of all time, and of course I love his guitar playing in the Smiths records. I mean, it sounds so elementary compared to the stuff that he's doing now, and he's really developed, over the course of the 10 years between Boomslang and Messenger, the way he developed the most, I would argue, is in a songwriting and singing capacity. Now, his voice on this record, the Boomslang record, and the songwriting on this record is good. It's totally adequate. It isn't necessarily the greatest thing you've ever heard, and his songwriting isn't necessarily, earth-shattering, but the songwriting on The Messenger is just vastly improved, and his vocals are just vastly improved. I mean, Johnny Marr's voice is one that I've actually come to really love. Now, again, going back to Morrissey, you hear this a lot because it's sort of fashionable right now to hate Morrissey or be anti-Morrissey. And I would make the argument as a Morrissey fan that it's always sort of been fashionable to hate Morrissey or be anti-Morrissey. Being picked on as a Morrissey fan isn't something that's anything new to most Morrissey fans. It's something that we sort of became accustomed to. We realize who we are in the sort of overall rock and roll community. Morrissey fans are outsiders. We were never the cool kids. We were always the people who sort of stood on the periphery of society and acted as observers. And I think most of us are comfortable in that station in life. But what you see right now, or what I've noticed is, people, because of the way that Morrissey has sort of, fallen out of so many people's good graces based on his opinions and the fact that he refuses to censor himself and mute his opinions. And, the fact that we live in a society where people are very easily offended, and it's socially acceptable to sort of be a victim and have your feelings hurt easily. That, you hear people say things that are just factually inaccurate. I've heard people say, and I've seen people comment, that Johnny Marr is a better singer and songwriter than Morrissey anyway. And, that's not even really an opinion. That's just factually inaccurate. It reminds me of a person that I used to know who one time told me that he thought that Big Audio Dynamite were a better band than The Clash. And he could sit there and try to make an intellectual argument all he wanted, but the fact of the matter is it's just inaccurate. I mean, to me, that would be like saying that, Morrissey is a better guitarist than Johnny Marr. Now, I understand if you're upset with Morrissey. I understand if you feel betrayed by him. I understand if you feel as if you can no longer support him. I understand if you feel offended by the things he says. But let's not say things that are just categorically incorrect. Morrissey is the greatest singer and songwriter in the history of rock and roll, at least in my opinion. Now, you don't have to agree that he's the greatest singer and songwriter in the history of rock and roll, but if you think that Johnny Marr is a better singer and songwriter than Morrissey, I mean, you're just virtue signaling at this point in time, which is just ingenuine, and I don't have any place in my life for people that are dishonest. It's the same thing going back to that Boz Borer album. Now, I get that, people love Boz Borer. I love Boz Borer. My criticism of his album was not meant to be personally offensive, but if you go back and you look at comments that people leave on the social media channels when it comes to that album, it's a little bit over-complimentary in some cases. Now, again, I'm not somebody who's out here to promote negativity. Archaic Records is not a negative place. And I understand politeness. Trust me, I think the world needs a lot more positivity and politeness. But let's not be dishonest here. Let's not say that it's better than the stuff that Morrissey produced. And what's funny is, going back to this sort of Smiths reunion and this box set thing that Morrissey's got his panties all twisted up in, is the fact that this gives people an opportunity to take sides with Johnny Marr, because Johnny Marr is a lot more unassuming and quiet and possibly a more likable human being. But again, it gives people artillery to always come back and slam on Morrissey, which is something as a Morrissey fan that I just won't tolerate. You understand? But that is something on this record that is so much drastically improved over Boomslang. To me, this is probably, of the Johnny Marr solo records, which there are 4 or 5 if you count Boomslang, this one is actually probably my favorite. When this record was released in the United States, unlike Boomslang, I do remember seeing a lot of sort of fanfare and hype and promotion over this record. This is a record that I was just so extremely excited about when it was announced, because, Johnny Marr is pretty much my favorite guitar player of all time, and I was very curious to see what his records would sound like. And I got to tell you that I really love the sound that he's developed. Now, all 4 of his records, I would say stylistically and sonically, are sort of similar, whereas, Morrissey is somebody that his catalog is continually evolving. Morrissey doesn't necessarily repeat himself in terms of the way that his records sound. I think that the Johnny Marr records all kind of have sort of a sound to them. Now, I'm not hating on it, because I really love the sound that he has created. It is a unique sound. I feel like when you hear these Johnny Marr records, you definitely know who it is. But I would say of the 4 Johnny Marr records, this one is probably my favorite. This is the one that I go back and listen to, certainly in the heaviest rotation. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I do not listen to Boomslang or the Johnny Marr solo albums nearly as much as I listen to the Smiths or the Morrissey solo albums. I mean, it's really not even close. But this is an album in the Johnny Marr catalog that I go back and listen to easily. The most. This record was released on February 25th, 2013. It was produced by Johnny Marr and James Doviak. This album features both of Johnny Marr's children, Niall and Sonny, along with Max James, Jack Mitchell, and James Doviak. This record has a lot of really excellent material on it. I think some of the high points of this record, apart from, honestly, the the weakest songs on this record to me are the first two tracks on this record. I don't necessarily love The Right Thing, Right. And I Want the Heartbeat is not necessarily my favorite song on this record either. But beyond that, this record is really great. I love the song European Me. Upstarts is awesome. The Lockdown is just killer. Generate it's passable. Sun and Moon is awesome. The Crack Up is awesome. Newtown Velocity is cool. Word Starts Attack is good, but my favorite song on this record is the title track, The Messenger. It was the first song that I ever heard off this record, and I thought it set a good tone for what this record is all about. So if you haven't gone back and checked out Johnny Marr's solo debut album, The Messenger, I would highly recommend it. I do not believe that you will be disappointed, and we are all eagerly awaiting the re-release of the Boom Slang album on a proper vinyl release. I am beyond excited. One more thing to get to before we get out of here this week, featuring, unfortunately, more news from the big guy, Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey. This week, it was released in an article, I believe it was The Guardian, if I'm not mistaken, where Morrissey continues to sort of bemoan the fact that he cannot find a suitable partner to release his newest album, Bonfire of Teenagers, an album which he maintains is the greatest album of his life, something that I'm a little skeptical, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, you're going to tell me that Bonfire of Teenagers is better than the stuff from the Smiths or the classic era of the Morrissey solo records? I find that a little bit hard to believe, although I am optimistic, and I've said this before in the past. If California Sun and Not a Dog on a Chain are any indicator, I'm very excited about this new record. I'd be excited about this record regardless, especially once I heard the single Rebels Without Applause, which to me is still one of the best songs that he's put out in probably a decade. But the other song that I've heard just way too much of, to be perfectly honest with you, of course, The Telephone Rings, man. That song is not snug, my friend. But Morrissey came out this week bemoaning again the fact that he cannot find a suitable dance partner to release his album, which has become a bonfire of drama. Get it? Stating that because he lives in a culture of idiocy, which, of course, I mispronounced that word, didn't I? A culture of idiocy, which is something that I'm not going to sit here and disagree with you on, Morrissey. But if you're looking to sort of endear yourself to the public, I might watch what you're saying. Now, I'm not pro-censorship. Trust me. I defend everything that Morrissey says. I don't defend everything he says. I defend his right to say it. I don't agree with everything that the guy says. You don't have to agree with everything that anybody says, nor should you. You should never always agree with what somebody says. But I will defend his right to say it. But I got to say this, as I've said this in the past, when it comes to this new album, Bonfire of Teenagers, and the one that's coming out supposedly after it, Without Music, the World Dies, which has sort of, we're not hearing quite as much about as we used to. Understandably, we still got to get through the whole Bonfire of Teenagers thing. My question is this, and that is, why isn't this album just being put out as a self-release by this point in time? Now, Morrissey easily has the means to release this record, at least onto the streaming platforms. Now, of course, as a diehard fan who collects everything in a physical format, I want this record on CD, I want this record on vinyl, but why not just put this record out as a self-release? It is easy enough. Small, little, tiny independent bands do it all the time. You easily have the means to do it, and I would make the argument that Morrissey has the means to produce a full-on physical release of this record. So if he is so concerned about this record seeing the light of day, it is something that I know can be done, because there are bands that are putting out records every day, bands that I've never heard of, bands that I assume have very limited financial resources. One of my favorite newer bands in the world today is a band called Slow Dance with the Dead, a band that is from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this is a band that self-releases everything, and most people have no idea who these guys are. This band probably are a bunch of guys who just go to work every day and do the band thing as a side project. So until this record is released, I'm kind of to the point, and I've said this before, where I just don't want to hear it anymore, man. I understand that, it's frustrating. It has to be frustrating. It has to be just incredibly frustrating to feel as if you were being gagged, to feel as if you were being censored, to feel as if you are being punished for exercising something that is a right. Freedom of speech is a right. I understand that. It is the ultimate hill to die on. Without freedom of speech, I don't think anything else matters. So I'm not sitting here defending the fact that Morrissey has been quote-unquote gagged or canceled. I would never support the cancellation of anybody. Even Post Malone has a right to spout what he has to spout. But until this record is released, I've just kind of reached my point where it's like, dude, either put out the record or just stop talking about it at this point in time. Because it can be done. There is a way to have it be done. And I saw a comment on one of the social media outlets that sort of I agreed with, honestly. And that was saying that if this record flops, Bonfire of Teenagers, and Morrissey puts it out as a self-release, that he won't have anybody else to blame besides himself. And, that Morrissey has a hard time looking in the mirror when it comes to sort of, being honest a little bit, when it comes to personal criticism, something that, as I'm sure you can imagine, I'm quite good at, because when you suck at life as bad as I do, it just comes naturally. But no real news when it comes to the Bonfire of Teenagers album. This was an opportunity, I think, for Morrissey just to sort of put himself back out there in the media. I think all of this sort of, talking about the Smiths' possible reunion and the box set, which is supposedly either going to or not going to happen, and now, continue on with this Bonfire of Teenagers drama, which has been going on since 2021. Even I'm getting bored of it. I think that Morrissey has had kind of a rough couple weeks in terms of his public relations, because I don't think he's doing himself any favors, being the old guy in his backyard yelling at the sky. Either put out the record, which I think the record will come out at some point in time. Now, I don't think he's going to self-release it. I don't think that he has it in him to self-release it. I think he wants a business partner to put it out for him, which is understandable. And as being somebody that is as successful and as established with the fan base that Morrissey has, you'd think that this would be an attractive partnership for somebody to enter into. But again, I'm not advocating censorship. I'm not advocating gagging anybody. But referring to the public as a bunch of idiots is not really a good way to endear yourself to them, as far as I'm concerned, Steve. Now, I'm not disagreeing with you. Not disagreeing with you at all, but you can't have it both ways. Just put the record out yourself. Come on. I want to hear it already. As long as it's better than, of course, The Telephone Rings. That song is not the Jugs, son. Anyway, as I mentioned before, I will be heading out to San Francisco this week to go see Johnny Marr live at the Warfield in San Francisco. So for next Morrissey Monday in 2 weeks, I will come back and we will be talking a little bit about the show at the Warfield in San Francisco. I realize that you just pissed your pants with excitement, and I do apologize. But what can I tell you? We'll also be talking about the reissue of the Boom Slang album, so we'll actually have 2 Johnny Marr shows in a row when it comes to Morrissey Monday. I'm sure that will not make Steve very happy, but I'm very excited to go out and see the Johnny Marr show with James in San Francisco. I will also be hitting my old stomping grounds out in Oakland and Berkeley. It always feels good to get my feet back on my own home turf. Nothing against Nashville. It is a fine enough place to live, but I'm a Bay Arean at heart, I guess. So it always feels good to be back home. Anyway, man. Thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store like River City Records in Memphis, Tennessee, which just celebrated their 3-year anniversary. As I mentioned before, I will be at Amoeba Records in San Francisco and Berkeley next week. do believe that I am sporting some bonage, just thinking about it. Be sure to check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And I think that's going to do her. So until next time, my friends, talk to you then.